Hey, what's up there, YouTubers? Adjumants and a job community guys here today with another deck tech. So today we are going to be taking a look at a standard deck, and it is Bug Aggro. So before we get things started, if you guys have any suggestions, please leave them down in the comments below. Now, Bug is a color combination of black, blue, and green, and this deck is actually a improved and non-budget version of a deck that I did previously on the channel, which was a budget version of Simic that ran cards like Zameck Guildmage, Strangleroot Geist, Young Wolf, Experiment 1, and then also played off of other cool cards like Rapid Hybridization, Simic Charm, and Spell Rupture. So ultimately what I wanted to do with this deck is really just make it competitive, because I liked what I was able to do with this deck, especially with the interactions between removing counters off of like undying creatures and stuff like that. So ultimately the best option was to add black, because we had the ability to run cards like Dreg Mangler, also to run Duskmantle Seer, which is probably one of my favorite cards out of this deck. We also have the ability to run cards like Tragic Slip in the main board as well, and I also have another copy of Tragic Slip in the sideboard. But we also have the ability to run Abrupt Decay, which I think is a really, really important and powerful card in the meta right now, especially up against aggro-based decks. So ultimately, the best course of action was just add black to this deck, fix the mana up, make it non-budget, and just roll with it. And I've been having just amazing results with this deck. I really love this. So we're going to get things started here. Starting off at the beginning of our curve with our creatures, we have Experiment 1, which is a 1/1 for 1 green with Evolve. And we can remove 2+1/+1 counters off of him and regenerate him. So this makes him pretty rigid up against the control matchups that are running Supreme Verdict, just because we can remove the counters, regenerate, and just rework our way to getting him to be a bigger creature again. But even against up against like aggro matchups, he ends up being pretty big pretty quick, and your opponent's not going to be swinging like with quite all of their creatures. Like if they have 2/2s and you have a 3/3 Experiment 1, they're obviously not going to swing with it unless they have combat tricks, which could be expected. But Experiment 1 ultimately just is a really good attacker and blocker for us that also has the ability to stick around past wraths like Supreme Verdict. Then we have Young Wolf, which is a 1/1 for 1 green with Undying as well. So this card is a little bit, it's a little bit lackluster, to be honest, but it's exactly what we want in this deck. It's another 1-drop that we get to hit. Undying does work towards the advantage of Experiment 1, where if our creature dies, it comes back with a +1/+1 counter on it, and it's a 2/2 when it enters the battlefield, so that's going to trigger off like Experiment 1. So it's always awesome to have that interaction going on for us, but ultimately, it's another card that's going to work towards our advantage of being able to play off of removing counters off of it to draw cards with Zameck Guildmage. And on top of that, we can also use it with like Rapid Hybridization. But ultimately, it's a good card because it's another 1-drop that we can throw down, but it's also pretty decent for having like another creature up against the aggro matchup that we can just use as a blocker straight out. Then we have Strangleroot Geist, which is a 2/1 for double green with haste and undying. One of my favorite creatures for green to have in this deck. So pretty straightforward card. You're able to bash in your opponent with it, and it's a pretty decent blocker again for aggro, just because it has 2 power. So it's going to be able to block a fair amount of things, and then it comes back as a 3/2 if it dies, which is pretty perfect for us because it's just another card that we can use towards our aggro scheme and things. Then we have Snapcaster Mage, which I thought shouldn't not be in this deck. It definitely is a card that is really, really powerful, especially because we're not using expensive instants and sorceries in this deck. In fact, all the cards that we have in our main board, as far as non-creature spells go and non-lands go, they're all instants. So our Spell Ruptures, Simic Charms, Tragic Slips, and Rapid Hybridizations are all at an instant speed. So we definitely have the advantage of Snapcaster allowing us to recur those spells at any point in time that we see it fitting. So 2/1 for 2 flash, and allows us to flashback spells from our graveyard. I think that the most useful out of all of that would probably be like Spell Rupture and Tragic Slip. Those are probably the spells that I use the most to recur. Spell Rupture being for like the mid-range and the control matchups where up against like stuff like Jund mid-range, you're just able to counter out Thragtusks, you're able to counter out Garruk Primal Hunters, especially if they try to hit like Rakdos's return, you're able to counter that. Like, there's just so much good that Spell Rupture does for us. And not a lot of people see it. Like, they just don't see that card coming because it's not really that widely played. But in our deck, where we have a pretty decent base of creatures, especially like off of Undying, like if they killed your Strangleroot Geist and it's a 3/3 or it's a 3-power creature, not a 3-drop. If it's a 3-power creature, Spell Rupture is instantly mana leak. So Spell Rupture is just really good, and you get a lot of value out of having it. But like Snapcaster to recur like spells of that nature is just really awesome. Then we have Zameck Guildmage, which is a 2/2 for 1 green and 1 blue with 2 abilities, both of them being 1 green and 1 blue. I don't use the first one as much as I use the second one, of course, because we're playing off of like the Undying theme here. So remove a +1/+1 counter from a creature that we control, and we can draw a card. I have used the first ability sometimes when if it comes down to like having a Dreg Mangler and having 5 mana open, where we're able to use Zameck Guildmage's ability, pay the 1 green and 1 blue, and have our creatures enter in the battlefield this turn with an additional +1/+1 counter, then tap our mana, play Dreg Mangler, have it be a 4/4 with haste, which is pretty solid. Like, that's really good to have a 4/4 with haste that could either bash in or just be a really good blocker up against aggro. So it's pretty good for that. Makes the creature like avoid Searing Spear, which is always pretty perfect for us. But it also really, like, the only removal that hits into it is like Mizzium Mortars, so that's pretty awesome for us as well. But yeah, like, Dreg Mangler is our next creature, so it's a 3/3 for 3 with haste and scavenge. I don't use the scavenge as much. However, I have seen the opportunity to use it a few times, especially on Duskmantle Seer. So being able to like to scavenge the Dreg Mangler onto something like Seer where it has evasion, or like onto any other creature just to make it a little bit more rigid is pretty awesome. But a 3/3 for 3 with haste is just exactly the aggro thing that we want to do with this deck. Then we have Duskmantle Seer, which is a 4/4 for 4 with flying, and it essentially has Bob's ability. For those of you guys that are familiar with Bob, otherwise known as Dark Confidant. So at the beginning of your upkeep, each player reveals the top card of his or her library, loses life at equal to that card's converted mana cost, and then puts that card into their hands. So with Duskmantle Seer, like, it's obviously not as good as Dark Confidant, just because Dark Confidant is just incredibly powerful. The power level of that card is just ridiculous. But Duskmantle Seer is the closest that we can get to it for this deck, and it's pretty perfect just because our converted mana cost curve only goes up to 4, and that 4-drop being Duskmantle Seer, so we're not going to be punished by running Duskmantle Seer and drawing into like any of our other cards. And honestly, like, most of the time, the cards that we're revealing off the top of our library are going to be lands anyway, but being able to draw more and just have card advantage is really good. But it's also going to punish our opponents, especially if they're playing high-cost stuff. If it's like the mid-range and the control matchups, is really going to punish them for running high-cost stuff, and they're going to lose a pretty decent amount of life off of the Duskmantle Seer, which just gets us closer to winning the game. Then we have our non-creature spells, which are our 4 Rapid Hybridization, which is a instant for 1 blue where we destroy target creature and its controller gets a 3/3, being a frog lizard token, which is awesome. So hybridization obviously plays off of our Undying creatures if we want to get more board presence and still keep our creatures around. Obviously, like, the thing that we mentioned before with like the Guildmage being able to remove counters off of Undying creatures and then just keep them around and keep them even more rigid makes it pretty good. So hybridization can be used to stack our board as well as a removal element for our opponent's things. If they have stuff like Thundermaw, Hellkites, Aurelias, like anything, it's just a universal removal. Like, sure, they get a 3/3, but it's better for them to have a 3/3 than like Olivia Voldaren or Thundermaw, Hellkite, Aurelia. There are just so many things that Rapid Hybridization can give us value off of being able to just have a removal spell for that, and it's easily recurred with Snapcaster Mage. Then we have Tragic Slip, where it's going to give target creature -1/-1 for 1 black, but with Morbid, it's going to give that creature -13/-13 instead if a creature died this turn. So, of course, like, if we swing into our opponent, or if we like block something and our opponent decides to like trade, or just even one of our undying creatures dies or something like that, we get value because we're able to use Tragic Slip and get rid of our opponent's things. It's also a really important card up against the Aristocrats matchup, just because they can sack things into Falkenroth Aristocrat, and we can just respond after it resolves with Tragic Slip and get rid of their Aristocrat, because it gives minus 13, and it's not just a form of like destroy or any form of like removal that would otherwise not work because their creature's indestructible. So Tragic Slip's pretty good up against them. It also hits into a lot of different things. Like, obviously, it's going to be able to give any creature minus 13, which is pretty much going to hit into like everything. So Tragic Slip ends up being pretty good for us, and it works really well. Then we have Simic Charm, which is a instant for 1 green and 1 blue, and it has 3 modes, all 3 of which are pretty playable for us. It can give our creatures hexproof, or it can give a creature +3/+3, or it can return a creature to its owner's hand. So it can be an unsummon, a giant growth, or it can give our creatures hexproof. So I really like Simic Charm. It's really easy to cast, and it can be really good for us to respond to things, whether it's spot removal that our opponent's using that targets, or if it's anything like if our opponent's trying to like double block and they're all tapped out, we can just like Simic Charm and have our creatures survive and potentially get rid of 2 of their creatures or something like that. So Simic Charm's ultimately good for that, but it also has the bounce feature with the unsummon mode, where we can just get rid of one of our opponent's creatures, and just that's one less thing that is going to be on the board like as a potential blocker or threatening us or anything like that. And then we have Spell Rupture. Spell Rupture being our counter spell at an instant speed for 2. Counters target spell unless its controller pays X, where X is the greatest power among creatures that we control. So it's better up against mid-range than it is up against control, because control, when they get to the late game, Spell Rupture isn't as amazing, but up against like mid-range, Spell Rupture is just awesome, especially if our opponent taps out and they think like, alright, well, you're not really going to have like a counter spell or something like that, not in your type of a deck at least. But then we have Spell Rupture and they're tapped out, and even if we have like a 1/1 creature, that's just enough. That's exactly enough that we need to just be able to counter that spell. So Spell Rupture ends up working pretty well to our advantage. Then we have our mana base, which is just 22 lands, which is pretty good because our curve only goes up to 4. We have a playset of Overgrown Tomb, playset of Breeding Pool, 2 Watery Graves, so 10 shocks total. Then we have a playset of Hinterland Harbor, playset of Woodland Cemetery, and 2 Drowned Catacomb, and then just 2 basic forests. So that's the main board for our deck. Now let's switch over and take a look at what we have in the sideboard. Alright, so with our sideboard here, the first card that we're taking a look at is Abrupt Decay. So Abrupt Decay is a 3-of in our sideboard. It's an instant speed card for 1 black and 1 green, which can't be countered by spells and abilities, and it's going to destroy target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less. Abrupt Decay is really important up against the really quick-paced aggro decks like Naya Blitz, just because it's removal that isn't going to have a bias against like any power or toughness that said creature would have. So it's not like a targeted removal like Searing Spear where, oh, they just get their creature to 4 toughness and they instantly survive that or anything like that. Abrupt Decay is ultimately really awesome just because it gets rid of stuff early on. It doesn't allow other decks to just gain this unheard of momentum against us or anything like that. And it just offers a really good instant speed removal. Same with the Tragic Slip that I wanted to have in there as well, just as another 1-of in the sideboard. So ultimately 3 Tragic Slips between the main board and the sideboard. But Tragic Slip is another card that's just really good up against the early aggro game decks like Blitz, where they play turn 1 champion, we play our land. If it's like a shock land, we pay 2 life and we Tragic Slip their champion. Or we can wait during their turn where like they play a creature and then we respond to the creature entering the battlefield with Tragic Slip and being able to get rid of it there. So Tragic Slip is ultimately really good. It allows us to play pretty well up against the aggro decks and not really have any awkward situations where our opponent's just trampling over us for like a whole lot. So 3 Abrupt Decay and 1 Tragic Slip for aggro. I also have 3 Cremate. that I'm using for the Reanimator based decks. So it's exile target card from a graveyard for 1 black and draw a card. The biggest thing about Cremate was being able to draw a card over things like Grafdigger's Cage or Tormod's Crypt, or even Deathrite Shaman. All of those cards run the risk of being Abrupt Decayed because in those colors, like the Reanimator decks just have the ability to run that. There's 4-color Reanimator decks, and then there's just the junk Reanimator decks, but ultimately, like, Cremate just gets rid of things, and your opponent doesn't have a way of being like, alright, well, I'll respond to your Cremate. They just don't have it. So, Cremate allows us to exile their targeted card that they're targeting with Unburial Rites, which most cases it'll be like Angel of Glory's Rise in the combo Reanimator decks, and for the junk Reanimator decks, like there's a lot of various things like Craterhoof Behemoth, Thragtusk, Angel of Serenity. There are just a lot of potential things. Obzidot as well. So Cremate just allows us to respond to whatever they're targeting, get rid of that target, and then also draw a card, which can let us get more answers against them or just get more things that we can use as a aggro approach and just beat them down. So Cremate's ultimately really good. I'm also running 2 Duress up against the more non-creature based mid-range matchups and also control as well. So Duress is really good because it lets us see what our opponent has in their hand, and then we're able to choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. So, like Planeswalkers or any instant sorcery spells that could be used against us and would be otherwise pretty unfortunate for us. So up against like Esper Control, we're able to get rid of Sphinx's Revelation, any Planeswalkers that they have, stuff like that. We're also able to get rid of like Supreme Verdict if they have it, if it's really like running us the risk of losing everything that we have and we don't have a way to bounce back from it, which usually we should. But like Duress is really good, and I really like having it just as a 2-of. We also have 2 Garruk Relentless, which I like siding in against control. So 3 loyalty, 4 cost, and essentially he just makes 2/2s. That's the biggest reason why I like him. He's a token generator for us, and like control isn't going to be focusing way too much on like using Detention Sphere and stuff on us. They're going to be more focused on just having board wiping elements, Terminus, Merciless Eviction, Supreme Verdict, and just being able to get rid of our board. So like Garruk Relentless just hits the board and he just threatens them. He's just going to make 2/2s every single turn, which even post Wrath, like that's completely fine just because we can stack the board with more 2/2s in the following turns. So I like having Garruk Relentless. Also Negate is pretty good up against the mid-range and the control matchups as well, where it just counters target non-creature spell for 2, and it's easily recurred with Snapcaster Mage. Also Flash variants too. Flash variants are definitely something that we want to side in Negate against. And then the last card that we have is Golgari Charm as a 2-of, so 1 black and 1 green, and the implications of this card aren't quite as huge, but I like to side it in up against control decks because we're able to destroy target enchantment, which would be like the Oblivion Rings or Detention Spheres if they happen to use them, but we can also regenerate each creature that we control, so it allows us to have a kind of more widespread way of surviving Supreme Verdict. That would be pretty consistent for our opponent, but for us, like, not all of our creatures have Undying, so not all of them are going to survive, but with Golgari Charm, we kind of have our means of being able to either bounce back between 2 modes where we're getting rid of enchantments or we're just regenerating. So that is the bug aggro deck that I have here for you guys today. If you guys enjoyed it, please be sure to like, favorite, and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. The entire deck list is down below where you guys can use it as a reference, as well as all the previous decks that I've covered on this channel. Until next time, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day.